This talk is about mind-body basics. The first talk I did earlier is about kind of how hypnosis is an emerging profession that teaches people how to make the most out of their mind-body links. A lot of the professions seem to still subscribe to the Descartian or Cartesian split between mind and body. Not every culture or tradition splits mind and body. It's kind of an idea that started with René Descartes in the Western world, and that's kind of perpetuated since then, such that most of us living in a country like Canada or the US or the UK perceive a split between mind and body. Hypnotherapists are doing their part to mend this split, to kind of teach people how to have a good relationship between mind and body, so the thoughts you think help or at least don't harm you. So a little bit about myself for the new participants is that I have worked out of 15 Elm Street down the street for 16 years. I've just opened up this space. Literally today is the grand opening, so thank you for coming. And I hope that for the remainder of my career, I'm able to take what I've learned through individual sessions that I've been doing one-on-one. At this point, we count over 7,000 people in our client database. It's actually 0.1 something% of the GTA who I or my associates have hypnotized over the past 16 years. And I hope to take a lot of what I've learned through individual work and do it on a bigger scale. So partly through the internet, but partly through this space I've set up here, where we have more chairs we're still assembling. But eventually I want to be able to put up to 20 people in this room and be able to kind of deliver a message that speaks to the common humanity among the 20 people, and to speak once, but to affect more people at the same time. And if you've ever done sessions with me, or if you ever do sessions with me, you kind of know that what I'm talking about here is exactly what I communicate to my clients. And essentially, I'm teaching people how to think in a way that a confident, secure, happy, relaxed person might think in their circumstances. So even a confident, secure, relaxed person might, develop a smoking habit, or they might develop anxiety, or they might have a fear of flying, but they'll kind of see their situation differently than someone who might exacerbate thoughts about their circumstances, as like cigarettes being a need, or airplanes being terrifying. So one thing I talked about this morning is that there is such a thing as high quality thinking. There is also such a thing as low grade thinking that harms people who have those ways of thinking. And if there's one thing we do, it's to kind of instill high quality thoughts. And that's basically the topic of this conversation. I'll talk a little bit about how you might talk to yourself, but mostly I'm going to talk about what you might say to yourself when you talk to yourself inside your heads. Because I guarantee you that you're more hard on yourself than you are over anyone else. You're upholding a double standard for how you treat a person, such that everyone else gets your best thoughts and you get your own worst thoughts. So one point I want to make is that you don't need a special set of rules or a special list of words for talking to yourself inside your head. The same rules you uphold for a friend, a brother, a sister, a coworker are good enough for you. And the other point I want to make is you don't need special words. You don't need special ways to write affirmations to yourself, because if you know how to comfort a scared child, if you know how to encourage a friend who's starting a new venture, the same words you use for them are good enough for you. So The mind-body duality, it's kind of being recognized as unnecessarily divided. There seems to be more talk in the academic and research worlds, but in the general popular culture at large, about the mind-body link, or mind and body being two sides of the same coin, such that the division between mind and body is artificial. And hypnotists are very, very much on the side of the mind-body link being very, very real, and in fact accessible. Because a lot of people feel that the mind-body link is this academic subject that's talked about but not really concrete. Or they feel like it's for yogis and monks and martial artists and other people who've practiced for 20 years, and that they would have to go through the whole rigmarole of intentional practice and study before they master the mind-body link. But like I said, you don't need special rules for talking to yourself inside your head. It is unhypocritical and inclusive to talk to yourself precisely the same way that you speak to a friend or a family member or a colleague or a neighbor. So it's not just feelings that can be caused by the way you talk to yourself. It does affect physical symptoms as well, to kind of view your body in a positive and supportive light. So I'll use IBS as an example, because IBS is not too well understood by medicine at this point, and there does seem to be a strong mind-body connection with IBS, which means as a hypnotist, I see a lot of cases of IBS, and usually better self-talk can help. So even with physical symptoms, like pain and bloating and cramping, the way you talk to your body does seem to make a difference. The way that we make the most out of the mind-body link that we all have is to intentionally practice good self-talk. So the first thing that people kind of notice when I do a session with them to kind of help them overcome their stress or anxiety or other problem, the first thing they notice is they're more aware, they're more mindful of their own thoughts, which is the first domino. So if the final domino is that they have minimal IBS symptoms, or if the final domino is that they quit smoking cigarettes, the first domino, before we get to that end goal, is that they're aware of their thoughts. And that means that they can start to be discerning about which thoughts to keep and which thoughts to relinquish. Because not all thoughts that cross your mind are necessarily reality-based or helpful or kind or supportive or inclusive or anything else that you want a thought to be. I used the term double standard earlier because we already have a filter for how we speak to other people. It's a perfectly good filter. If you can keep a friend, if your family likes you, you have a good enough filter for knowing which thoughts are helpful and pro-social versus which other thoughts are unhelpful and cruel or antisocial. It's just you're not applying this filter to yourself. In kindergarten, we kind of learn that we have to treat other people kindly, right? Somehow, they don't teach us to treat ourselves kindly too. And as children, we do kind of, if we're lucky, we have parents and teachers to treat us kindly, to give us the validation and the support that we need. But if life goes according to plan, eventually the child becomes an adult. And the adult is not going to have people hovering over and saying, hey, good work, well done, good job, keep that up. But they will get, you didn't do this well enough. Or, even harder criticism. So we have to be our own best sources of validation and encouragement and all the kind thoughts that we might wish upon anyone else who we're responsible for. And somehow this message kind of gets lost. And, you know, I work primarily with educated downtown professionals. And it seems like a lot of their drive comes from feeling not good enough and then feeling like they have to achieve before they feel okay with themselves. And yet, this does cause much stress, much anxiety, much sleeplessness, and sometimes physical symptoms. If they take on the view that they have innate worth, just to pick an example, you have innate worth, and if you achieve something, if you win that case, if you cure that patient, you get to feel especially good, especially rewarded, but the baseline's not zero. But, you know, that's a worldview, that's a way of thinking that's going to prevent stress from arising in the first place because they already have the most important thing. And anything they do just makes them feel extra good. So just to kind of make this a little bit less abstract and a little bit more realized, let's try on two different thoughts. And I want you to notice how holding each of these two thoughts affects the way you feel beneath the neck. Because I can already predict that these two thoughts are going to affect the way you feel beneath the neck differently. The first thought is, this talk that Luke is giving is probably going to have some helpful ideas. So hold that thought. This talk that's going to continue for the rest of the hour is probably going to have some helpful ideas. Notice how that makes you feel. It's going to be a certain feeling. Okay, now let's put that aside, and let's take on the thought. This talk that Luke is going to give is probably going to be a waste of my time. Right? You feel a whole lot differently beneath the neck. And if you think it's going to be a waste of time, you're probably not going to really listen. You're probably not going to get much out of it. You're probably going to actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy then that the talk wastes your time. But if you tell yourself that this talk is probably going to contain some helpful ideas, you're probably going to get something out of it, then you're actually listening. Then you can actually kind of create a self-fulfilling prophecy where as long as I fulfill my end of the bargain and I give you good ideas, like as long as, you know, it's a good talk, then you're going to get something out of it. It's one example. But I think it puts the abstract idea of the mind-body link into this palpable, visceral experience of either becoming more attentive or less attentive, even frustrated, because of one sentence you think to yourself. Now, all of us think a whole lot more than one sentence any given minute, let alone hour or day. And that's why self-talk matters so much. That's why if you start applying the same filters that you apply when you speak to friends or neighbors for the kind of conversation that you'll have in your inner world, a lot can change from that. As a hypnotherapist, people kind of expect me to speak for a few hours and then make a lasting change, or sometimes 1 hour and then make a lasting change, and that does happen. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. It happens when the ideas I'm communicating for the client to accept are reality-based and helpful, but which also generalize. So This idea of speaking to yourself like a friend generalizes to falling asleep at night. It generalizes to not getting too stressed by work. It generalizes to what if you're about to take a big risk and you don't know whether you can make it. It generalizes to, well, every challenge that I can imagine. If the rules that you apply for being a decent, pro-social person seem to affect your friends positively, the same set of rules will affect you positively when you're upholding them in your own inner dialogue. What causes a lot of unnecessary distress within one's inner world is when you uphold a very different set of rules that usually is not best practice. So it's harsh, it's cruel, it doesn't recognize the positive. And if you were harsh and cruel and never recognized the positive about anyone else, you can't expect to maintain the friendship or the relationship, and the other person's going to escape you. They're going to separate themselves from you. The thing about your body is that it cannot escape you. It just has to kind of like listen. And that gives you almost a moral obligation to speak to your body kindly. It's because it cannot escape you. Whatever you think is going to be felt beneath the neck, one way or another. If you think like a confident, secure person, if you uphold innate worth for you and for others, for example, then you're going to feel like a confident, secure person, at least in that regard. If you tell yourself that terrible things are going to happen, you will cause yourself fear, and if you're not seeing terrible things with your own eyes, then unnecessarily. There are forms of suffering that we can't really prevent with an attitude change or a change in thinking. But there are a lot of forms of suffering that we can prevent with an attitude change or a change in perspective. And that's kind of the realm that a hypnotherapist works in. There are some rules for adulthood that we don't really get briefed on once we turn 18. And what it means is that a lot of us are kind of upholding the rules for children for ourselves. And of course, you kind of started life as a child. So for the first maybe 15, 16, 18, 20 years of your life, you kind of had a seat at the kids' table and not the grown-up table. You kind of had to follow the rules for children, not the rules for adults. But I've worked with clients who are in their 40s or 50s or 60s, and in their own heads, they're kind of still upholding the rules for children. Like, your opinion doesn't count as much as everyone else's. Everyone else knows more than you. You should just listen and let other people talk. Even though they're legitimately an adult. So one kind of principle that I'll give to you is that if you're of an age where at election time your conscience is way up there with every other voter, and you get to help decide the future of your city or province or country, then we're going to count you as an adult. The rules for adulthood apply by the time that your vote counts equally to every other adult on planet Earth. I know that the line of 18 is somewhat arbitrary, but the world does consider you to be an adult after 18. Everyone in this room appears to me as older than 18. Most people watching on YouTube are going to be more than 18, which means the rules for adulthood apply. You have a permanent seat at the grown-up table. And if you're not fulfilling it, it's going to be empty until you take that seat. And that means you can feel like an equal, legitimately. to the other adults at work, or to the, even to your own parents. And you don't just have to internalize another person's way of thinking or another person's opinions or another person's perspective where you disagree with them. One of the privileges of adulthood is you get to decide where other people are wrong and where you are right. And you don't just have to obey. So there is a distinction between the rules a child has to follow because they legitimately don't have enough years on the planet to make their own decisions, versus the rules of adulthood, where we do have enough years on the planet where we can make our own decisions and make our own choices. And again, I'll point to the ballot box as a very tangible example of how highly society values your opinion as an adult. This kind of thing matters. And it's usually with parents that one often feels like he or she is less than another adult. So, one might be in her 30s or in his 40s and still feel like less of an adult than their parents. And their parents would enable this because your parents kind of knew you first as an infant or a newborn before they've known you as an adult. So sometimes your parents will treat you according to the rules of a child. And I'll say it, you have to resist because you're not actually a child. And if you kind of lead by example and do your best to normalize an adult-to-adult relationship with your parents, it's going to be easier to have an adult-to-adult relationship with other authority figures, like an employer, for example. So that's one of the principles. You are a real adult. In your own head and heart, at least, you should uphold the rules for adulthood, not the rules that children have to follow only until they have enough experience and good judgment to make their own decisions. So that's going to filter some of your thoughts. There are going to be some thoughts that you're going to recognize are no longer current or helpful or necessary if you put them through that filter of, is this a rule for adulthood? Or does this follow the rules for adulthood? Or is this a leftover thought from childhood that became obsolete when I gained the right to vote? Another principle is that your cup never has to be empty. I'll have to explain this further. So when you were a child, when you first kind of internalize your worldview, you were kind of too small to get your own glass of water. So sometimes you might have had to suffer thirst in your own home. You would have to wait for a parent to come along. They'll reach for a glass, they'll reach for the faucet, they'll give you the water, and only then would your thirst be satisfied. And then you reach an age where you can just kind of reach the cupboard yourself to get your own glass, and you can reach the faucet, and you can drink all the water you wanted to drink, and you never had to be thirsty in your own home again. Right? The same applies for love and validation and positive attention and care. These are needs like water. As a child, you might have needed a parent to come along and say, hey, you did well, good work. You might have needed a parent to make you feel safe and loved and secure. But at some point, and this kind of ties in with my prior point about adulthood, at some point you become a source of validation for others. You become a source of love for others. You become a source of positive regard for others. And to kind of loop it back to the topic of having one universal standard by which we treat people, your self-love counts. It's not lesser love because it comes from you. It's actually coming from the highest authority over you. When you love yourself, it's coming from the best informed source when you love yourself. I mean, maybe when you were 5, your parents knew more about you than you. Probably around adolescence, they just couldn't possibly know more about you than you. At some point, we all must gain self-authority, where from that place of authority over ourselves, we can make our self-love count. We can make positive self-regard count. We can make self-respect count. We can make self-validation count. Now, we all kind of get that, if you instill self-love and self-respect in a teenager or a child, that child is going to be harder to bully. They're going to be harder to peer pressure. That self-love and self-respect are good, right? Well, the things we teach children are not really supposed to be just for them and not for us. If it's good enough for a child's worldview, I would suggest it's good enough for your own. So if you can understand that self-love and self-respect and self-validation are an unalloyed good for children or for others, it's unhypocritical to feel the same for yourself. So, as an adult, your cup never has to be empty. If you feel like your cup is empty, you've forgotten that you have a faucet within, and you have the wherewithal to fill that cup on your own. You don't need a parent or partner or employer or government official to come along and say you're worthy, because your opinions on you matter. Perhaps even more than a random person's opinions of you. So, when you apply the principle of your cup never having to be empty, of making self-love and self-worth and self-respect count, that gives you another way to kind of filter your thoughts. So that there are going to be some thoughts that you don't have to keep, and some other thoughts you can self-generate, with or without a hypnotist. Another principle I want to share when it comes to kind of rules that you might apply to yourself unhypocritically. We have a different set of rules for how we treat living beings, like, say, houseplants or cats and birds and trees and flowers and friends and neighbors, versus objects like computers and cell phones and cars and buildings. Right? The rules we apply for living beings kind of recognize the inviolable worth of life. If you're a well enough socialized person, if you're a decent enough person, you're going to have a hard time just chopping down a tree. Like, unless you need the firewood, you're going to have a hard time just like chopping down a tree for sport. You're going to have a hard time just neglecting a wounded bird that lands on your windowsill. Because there are rules for how we treat life. But we can curse at computers without consequence. We can leave a car sitting in the garage for half a year without any positive attention, and then you brush it off, maybe you inflate the tires. It's still good. You can't treat any living thing like that. So the mistake that a lot of us make, and we could blame the industrialization of the educational system or anything else, the mistake a lot of us make is we incorrectly categorize ourselves as an object, not as life. We are correctly categorized as life, and the rules for life apply. We would be incorrectly categorized as an object where, we could curse at an object without consequence. So there's another filter for your self-talk. for affecting yourself positively and beneficially through the mind-body link. A lot of the stress and the anxiety that people carry comes from upholding the rules for objects, not for living beings. If you treat yourself as a living being and not as an object, my guess, my prediction, is you're going to feel a whole lot better beneath the neck. And that just underscores the point of your aliveness. Another principle to uphold when it comes to what you might tell yourself is that regardless of your chances at succeeding at anything, the right thing to tell yourself is that you can, not that you can't. So if we imagine an athlete before a game or a warrior before a battle, he or she, in their heads, must prepare for success and victory. They must tell themselves they can. If we imagine the athlete before a game or a warrior before a battle telling themselves they can't, that's a person who's making it way too easy for their opponent, unnecessarily. Because once that person starts to tell him or herself that they can, they are going to affect how they feel beneath the neck a whole lot differently. Your body prepares for what you tell it. If you are mentally preparing for bad things to happen, your body is going to get tense, anxious. It might even go into fight or flight mode because in your head you're telling it that bad things will happen, or at least you're thinking that bad things will happen, and your body is overhearing because the mind-body link is real and it's always present. So again, because the mind-body link is real, because your body's always listening, you kind of owe it to yourself. And no one gets this perfectly, by the way. The standard is not perfection. The standard is making an effort, at least, when you catch yourself, and making incremental progress toward an ideal that maybe not even monks or yogis ever completely reach. So it's always the right thing to tell yourself that you can, because that maximizes your chances of success, regardless of what the chances would be seen objectively. So like if you're a professional athlete and you're evenly matched, right? There's a 50-50 chance you're going to win or lose. Like in Vegas, the odds will be about even if you're evenly matched. It's still the right decision for each athlete to prepare for victory. It's still the right thing for each person to tell him or herself that they can, because that line of thought leads to their bodies preparing to win. Another principle. This kind of goes along with the message of aliveness. You have innate worth and dignity. It's only objects that don't. Objects we can toss out without guilt, usually. Houseplants. I have like withered houseplants because I can't bring myself to, like, they're alive. They're alive. But, like I got busy with work and they're kind of withered, and I can't bring myself to toss them out, because as long as they're alive, they have a future. As long as they're alive, they can be rehabilitated. As long as they're alive, I just have to make sure to be more mindful, make sure they get enough water, but not too much of it, and enough sunshine. And that plant will have a future. So you also have innate worth such that you cannot easily be discarded. And being among human life also gives you a kind of innate dignity that allows you to hold your head up high in all circumstances. Most people don't want you to crawl into a hole and never show your face again, even when you feel like that. We all cheer the figure skater who gets right back up again after falling down. You know, we kind of want to uphold rules for society that kind of recognize innate worth and dignity. We celebrate the worth and dignity that we have. So if you do ever feel like you have to crawl into a hole, or if you ever feel that you're worthless, you might be the only one. And when you think differently, there might be no one on, I would guess, there's no one on the planet who wants you to feel that way. So you actually have the power to decide that no one's going to feel you're worthless when you do. And whenever you feel worthless, you know, if we're going to uphold this principle, it means you got distracted from the worth that's there, not that it went away. So if you've ever seen a friend, you know, get broken up with, or they made a big mistake and they're really hard on themselves, you can see how they get distracted from their worth. At the same time, you see the worth in your friend. You know that after some time, they're going to see their own worth again, and their worth hasn't gone anywhere. They just got distracted from it. Just like we sometimes get distracted from our breathing, so we breathe too shallowly. We get distracted from our heartbeat, so we forget we're alive. And to recognize feelings of worthlessness or deep shame as a sign that you got distracted from your aliveness and your humanity and your innate worth, that's the line of thinking that I want to give you. So when there's no possible future for you ever to be worthless, because there's no possible future where you're ever correctly categorized as an object, this makes it much easier to be optimistic, to do the things you want to do, because the worst case scenario is you hold your head up high and life goes on. And I actually believe that's the truth. The worst case scenario. I mean, in our society, even if you murder someone, after a certain sentence with good behavior, you're released back into society. This is the world we live in. When I talk about instilling reality-based worldviews, the idea that you can hold your head up high and life goes on is the one you'll see with your own eyes when you're looking for that. Probably no one wants you just to crawl into, I mean, obviously, if you commit a crime, then you know, the world's not going to be on your side. But if you commit a social faux pas, probably no one wants you to crawl into a hole. Probably they're quite forgiving. And when you hold your head up high and life goes on, that's how you minimize the suffering in the world, because your own internal suffering does count. So just to kind of address one of the objections that sometimes people raise, that, you know, because of the things we've heard as children, loving yourself is not going to make you arrogant. Having innate self-worth doesn't make you selfish. You're not going to turn into a narcissist because you have positive self-talk. There's this idea that I'm going to challenge. It's a popular idea that one must be self-effacing, that one must be hard on him or herself to be a good person, right? But we don't teach children like this, right? When it comes to others, we know that like self-love, self-esteem, self-worth, self-respect, self-validation, this is how you create a future leader. This is how you create someone whose cup is full to the point where they can give to others. So you're also not going to turn into a narcissist if you're self-loving. If you know anything about narcissism, you know that narcissists feel innately flawed. They don't have self-love or self-respect. They don't self-validate very well. So if you are applying the principles I'm talking about here, and you are loving yourself without inhibition, or with as little inhibition as you can muster, my guess is you're going to see with your own eyes that your friendships, if anything, get better. Your social relationships get better. And if your own eyes show you something differently, then you can come and complain to me. But my guess is that if your cup is full, and you're filling it yourself whenever it starts to go empty, and you're giving yourself the love you need, and you're giving yourself the validation you need, and you're giving yourself the respect you need, that other people are going to like you more. They are going to see a more confident person. They are going to like the fact that you're self-loving, and in actuality, no one wants you to feel bad about yourself. So everything I'm talking about is not just like a nice ideal. I'm doing my best actually to instill a reality-based worldview. It happens that reality is often much better than we estimate. It happens we often think that other people hate us more than they actually do. We often think that we're less capable than we actually are, but those are not reality-based worldviews. Anything you have to imagine because you can't see it with your own eyes is imagined. I mean, if people hate you, wait to hear it with your own ears. Wait to see it with your own eyes. If your own eyes and ears show you differently, it's worth believing the evidence of your senses. There's another principle. The evidence of your senses gives you better information about the world than anything you have to imagine because you can't sense it. I'll let that one sink in. Another source of objections is the inner critic. So I'm going to talk about the inner critic because a lot of people identify with the inner critic and they listen too much to the inner critic. But a workplace doesn't need a bully. A household doesn't need an abuser. A person's psyche doesn't need an inner critic. We already recognize that if we are to cause someone to thrive, it's not going to be through criticism so much as it will be through encouragement. And if we have to criticize them at all, saying it as gently as possible is the way to do it. Chances are you're upholding a double standard where your inner critic says things you would never verbalize to another person, and you actually listen. So one thing I've been telling my clients is that your inner critic is not your conscience. It's not actually a very good guide as to how to live as a decent person. Just like criticizing a child will not give them good guidance as to how to be a good person. But speaking your conscience, speaking that quiet voice that distinguishes right from wrong out loud is going to give good guidance to another, and it is going to give good guidance to you. Again, we keep coming back to this idea we must dispense with the double standards. If the ways you treat other people are good enough for them, then treating yourself according to the same standards will serve you. If it doesn't make other people arrogant when you show them encouragement or love, it's not going to make you arrogant when you show yourself the same encouragement or love. I am contradicting very popular ideas in the world. That's why I'm doing these talks. That's why I'm trying to do this on a bigger scale. it's because we don't necessarily want all the 20th century baggage that society still has to creep any further into the 21st century. It's because there is such a thing as good thinking and bad thinking that's universally applicable to all human beings. And when you do treat yourself like a friend, you can feel completely unhypocritical about it, right? You're not giving yourself special treatment. You're not making an exception for yourself. You're not being a hypocrite. It's the exact opposite of that. It's upholding what you already recognize to be the proper way to treat a person when you treat yourself like a friend. So the inner critic will give you none of that. What I advise to my clients is that they put their inner critic in an imaginary or metaphorical box and slap a label on that box that says devil's advocate, not a truth teller, not your conscience, do not trust. And that is, in my view, correct labeling for that line of thought that pretty much all of us have. And that does kind of make more room in your head for the quiet voice of conscience. I mean, the word conscience almost feels like, you know, I'm definitely from the 20th century because I don't hear the word as much any longer. But when I used to hear it, you know, it was the quiet voice at the back of your mind that helps you tell right from wrong. And I think that's a good definition for the conscience, the quiet voice that tells you right from wrong. That's how we know your inner critic is not your conscience. Your inner critic never recognizes the good things you do. It's a critic, but not like in the sense that one can appreciate art, and you know, they're like an art critic. The inner critic can't appreciate anything. If your inner critic has never said anything good about good things you have done, its opinions have no merit. For the same reason that a restaurant reviewer or a book reviewer who only gives 0-star reviews, regardless of the worth or merit of the book or restaurant, that critic can't, you know, its criticism has no nuance or merit and doesn't deserve our attention. Your inner critic, if it acts like that, if it only tears down with no constructiveness, its opinions are worthless. The opinions that you might turn to if you're looking for a restaurant or a book are the ones that can recognize something good. And because those opinions recognize something good, they'll also reserve some harsh words when one does not, you know, do their work very well. The opinions with merit will, you know, will be on a scale of 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, but the whole range. So your conscience can actually say, well, that wasn't very good behavior. You can do better next time. That's like a 0-star review from your conscience. Your conscience can also say, this is my understanding. I mean, like, if you disagree, you can share afterward or leave a comment in the comment section. But your conscience can say, good work. That's the way to do it. Let's see more of that. Well done. Good job. At the same time, you know, it'll correct you if it has to. Those kinds of opinions that can appreciate and criticize have much more significance and benefit when it comes to being guided to living a good life or being a good person or judging the quality of your own work. But any line of thought that doesn't even recognize something good is like a bully. You don't have to care about opinions that come from such places. You don't have to care about opinions born of envy or resentment because they're not casting light on truth. You don't have to care about opinions born of hatred because they don't cast a light on truth. So in your own inner world, if you've got an inner critic and it hates everything, you don't have to care. Put it in a box, label it devil's advocate, do not trust, not a truth teller, not your conscience, so that you can listen to the quiet voice or voices at the back of your mind that sound like, how you might guide a child, or that sound like what you might say to a friend, when you do intend to give good guidance. And believe the evidence of your own eyes or ears. Because if you have to imagine it, then maybe it's not actually real. Maybe it's imagined. So, with the inner critic inside a box and some principles to uphold, where you are treating yourself like a friend, and you are treating yourself to a universal standard of what you already understand to be proper treatment of a living, breathing human being, chances are you're going to feel a lot better beneath the neck. You can expect this when it comes to how you might form a relationship with a friend or a partner. If you speak to them like a living, breathing human being, they're going to like you a lot more and they're going to be happier. You treat them like an object, they're not going to like you, they're not going to be happy. Most friends can just decide not to return your calls anymore, but your body can't. So because your body is always with you, it's maybe the only lifelong friend you have. And because it's such a good listener, because the thoughts up here affect how you feel beneath the neck pretty much instantaneously, you kind of owe it to your body to be good to it.